They never missed a single Sunday. Rain or shine, in sickness or in health, the Hargreaves family sat in the front pew of St. Matthew's Church in rural Kentucky, 1883. People whispered about their devotion with admiration. But devotion was only what they showed the world. Beneath their house, in the soil of their cellar, something darker waited, something that no sermon could cleanse. The year was 1883, and the rolling hills of central Kentucky were still a place where faith defined community. Wooden farmhouses leaned against the wind, cornfields stretched in dusty rows, and the church bell was the heartbeat of every settlement. For miles, the chime at St. Matthew's signaled not just worship but belonging. To miss service was to invite questions, suspicion, even quiet judgment. And so the Hargreaves, with their pressed clothes and solemn faces, were the embodiment of virtue. At least, that is what everyone thought. Thomas Hargreaves was a man people trusted. Tall, with a hard jaw and steady eyes, he worked his land from sunrise to dusk and quoted scripture with ease. His wife, Margaret, was rarely heard above a whisper, but her quiet presence beside him seemed like the mark of a well-ordered household. Their 3 children, Mary, John, and little Samuel, were pale but polite, their heads always bowed when prayers were said. No one in the congregation failed to notice how straight they sat, how diligently they recited hymns, how carefully they avoided any hint of disobedience. The Hargreaves looked like a family carved out of faith itself. Yet even then, there were details that unsettled the watchful. The children's clothes were neat but worn thin, as though new fabric was too costly. Their eyes carried a hollowness unusual for youth. When neighbors offered food, Thomas always declined, insisting they had plenty. At night, the lanterns in their farmhouse burned longer than any farmers should, shadows flickering against the curtains. Some said they heard low chanting, though no one dared accuse a man so well respected. In a town bound together by worship, it was easier to look away than to confront what might be hiding in plain sight. The world of 1883 Kentucky was steeped in rules both written and unspoken. A family's place in the pew told others who they were. Church was not merely a ritual, it was a ledger of morality, an accounting of every soul. Those who faltered in attendance were whispered about over fence posts and market stalls. In this climate, the Hargreaves appeared flawless. They gave small coins to the collection plate, even in lean harvests. Thomas bowed his head so low in prayer it almost touched the wood, and Margaret's hands were folded so tightly they seemed carved in stone. They radiated the image of righteousness. But sometimes righteousness is only a mask. The first true hint came not from the family themselves but from the land they lived on. Their property, a modest stretch of farmland on the edge of town, held a farmhouse with a cellar dug deeper than most. In Kentucky, cellars were common, places to keep root vegetables cool through the sweltering summers. But the Hargreaves cellar had been widened, reinforced, and whispered about by those few who had glimpsed it. A root cellar big enough for a sermon, one neighbor joked. Yet none ever stepped foot inside. Thomas kept the door bolted, claiming it was too damp, too unsafe for visitors. Over time, the explanation hardened into truth, and people stopped asking. Still, curiosity lingered. A farmhand who once delivered hay late at night swore he heard voices from below, not the light chatter of a family but the rhythmic intonations of something closer to prayer, or ritual. He never spoke of it publicly, fearing ridicule or reprisal, but he avoided that farmhouse forever after. The memory of the voices followed him until his death. In town, though, nothing seemed amiss. The family walked the mile into St. Matthew's every Sunday, shoes polished, Bibles clutched. They sang with strength, especially Thomas, whose booming baritone filled the rafters. To outsiders, he was a man of conviction. Children were taught to respect him, women admired his discipline, and men nodded in approval when he passed. When the preacher spoke of steadfast faith, it was Thomas's face that parishioners pictured. If there was unease behind the family's eyes, it was ignored, swallowed by the comfort of a simple belief. People so faithful could not possibly harbor sin. The broader world was changing, railroads spreading, industries rising, but in Kentucky, tradition clung like summer humidity. Families measured their worth in crops, in cattle, in church attendance. And by that measure, the Hargreaves were untouchable. That is what made the events of that year so devastating. When the truth surfaced, it did not only unmask one family, it cracked the foundation of an entire community built on the illusion of moral certainty. But in 1883, before the scandal erupted, the signs were only shadows: a cellar too large, lights too late, children too quiet, and a family that smiled too perfectly, every Sunday, as though daring God himself to notice what lay buried beneath their home. The story of the Hargreaves family did not begin in scandal. It began, like so many others in rural Kentucky, with hard soil, stern discipline, and scripture. Thomas Hargreaves was born in 1844, the son of a veteran who fought under the Union banner. His father returned from the war scarred, a man of iron rules and few words. From him, Thomas inherited not just the family land but a rigid sense of order. To Thomas, faith was not gentle comfort. It was commandment. It was law. And it was fear. By the time he reached 30, Thomas had married Margaret Clark, the daughter of a merchant from a neighboring county. Margaret's upbringing had been different: educated, soft-spoken, raised in a home where books and music were valued. But her marriage to Thomas pulled her into a world where silence was survival. The community saw her as obedient, even pious. In reality, she rarely spoke at all. Neighbors recalled her eyes, always downcast, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles whitened. If there was discontent in her, she never showed it. The children, Mary, John, and Samuel, were the true puzzle. Mary, the eldest, was just 12 in 1883, already carrying herself with a maturity far beyond her years. She tended to her younger brothers with a gravity that seemed unnatural, as though childhood had been denied her. John, 10, was thin, his eyes ringed with shadows. He rarely laughed, even when other boys teased or played in the fields. Samuel, the youngest at 7, clung to his mother's skirts in public, silent except for the hymns he sang in church. They were children shaped by restraint, molded into something that fit the rigid order of their father's home. On the surface, the Hargreaves farm was ordinary. Rows of corn, a modest barn, a weathered porch where Thomas smoked his pipe at dusk. But there was one feature that drew whispers: the cellar. Unlike others in the county, theirs had been dug not only deeper but wider, lined with brick and reinforced beams. Farmers spoke of it quietly, marveling at the effort such construction required. Some claimed Thomas had spent weeks below ground, laboring with his own hands, sealing something inside, or preparing it for something yet to come. When asked, Thomas dismissed the curiosity. "A man takes care of his own," he said. No one pushed further. At night, however, the Hargreaves household became less ordinary. Farmhands who passed along the road spoke of lantern light flickering long after midnight. A peddler once claimed he heard low voices chanting, not quite singing, from beneath the earth. Others dismissed these stories as imagination, the embellishments of tired men and travelers. But whispers spread, as whispers always do, and some began to avoid the farm after dark. Still, no one dared accuse the family openly. Their place in church was unassailable, their piety shielded them like armor. The community around them, small and tightly woven, functioned on appearances. Reputation was as valuable as land, and the Hargreaves had both. To criticize them was to invite suspicion upon oneself, to risk being labeled envious or malicious. So people kept quiet. They watched the pale children, the silent wife, the stern father, and they said nothing. Silence was the currency of the town. What unsettled some, however, was Thomas's growing influence within St. Matthew's. He was not the preacher, but his voice carried weight. When he spoke at meetings, people listened. He quoted scripture fluently, weaving verses into arguments that seemed unassailable. He led prayers at gatherings, his booming voice filling the rafters. Some believed he should have been a minister himself, so fervent was his devotion. Others felt unease at the intensity in his eyes when he spoke of God's will, as though he alone understood its true meaning. Margaret's role was different. She embodied quiet submission, the ideal image of a church wife. Yet her silence spoke volumes to those who looked closely. The way she flinched when Thomas's hand brushed the table. The way her children never strayed from her side. The way her smile, rare as it was, never touched her eyes. But in a society where women's voices were rarely heard, her silence was mistaken for virtue. People admired her restraint without ever questioning its cause. By midsummer of 1883, unease in the town was palpable though unspoken. The children appeared thinner, their cheeks hollow, their movements slower. Mary was once seen carrying heavy baskets alone while her father watched impassively. A neighbor offered to help, but Thomas refused, his tone sharp enough to silence further offers. "My family is strong," he said. "They endure as God intends." The neighbor nodded, but later confided to his wife that the words chilled him. Despite these signs, the family's image remained intact within the church. Every Sunday, they filed into the front pew, their heads bowed, their Bibles clasped. The congregation looked on with admiration, even envy. The Hargreaves were a model of discipline in a world that demanded order. And so, when murmurs of strangeness arose, they were smothered beneath the weight of appearances. Who could question the family that never missed a sermon, that gave to the poor, that prayed louder than all the rest? But beneath the earth, behind the bolted door of the cellar, something stirred. The farm was no longer just a home. It was a vessel for Thomas's beliefs, a place where faith twisted into something unrecognizable. The community saw devotion. The children saw something else. And in time, the town would see it too, though by then, it would be far too late. The breaking point came in late August of 1883, when the quiet order of the town was shattered by a single absence. 10-year-old William Carter, the son of a blacksmith from a neighboring settlement, failed to return home after an afternoon spent fishing along the creek that cut through the Kentucky hills. At first, it was brushed aside. Boys often lingered too long, losing themselves in games or daring each other to wander deeper into the woods. But as the sun fell and the boys' place at the supper table sat empty, unease spread like a slow fog. By nightfall, lanterns dotted the fields. Men fanned out with dogs, calling his name into the dark. Mothers held candles at their windows, whispering prayers. The creek bank was searched, the woods combed, but no trace of William appeared. Only his fishing rod, caught in reeds by the water's edge, suggested where he had been. It was the first time in years the town had felt real fear. A fear not of storms or failing crops, but of something unknown moving among them. The search grew frantic over the following days. Posters were nailed to trees, and neighboring towns were alerted. Suspicion, that old parasite of small communities, began to creep. Some blamed drifters who had passed through after the summer fair. Others muttered about travelers on the new railway line. But as the days stretched into weeks, with no sign of William, suspicion began to settle closer to home. In whispers too soft for the pulpit but loud enough for kitchen tables, the name Hargreaves appeared. The reason was simple. The farm lay near the boys' last known steps. The creek curved not far from their land, and more than one searcher noted the odd quiet around the farmhouse. Dogs brought near the property whined, refusing to approach the cellar doors. Yet no one spoke openly against Thomas. To accuse him was to accuse the very image of devotion. How could a man who led prayers at funerals be guilty of something so monstrous? And still, the whispers grew. One woman, Sarah Whitfield, broke the silence. A widow who lived a half-mile from the Hargreaves farm, she told the sheriff of lights seen burning in the cellar long past midnight. She spoke of strange sounds, low moans, rhythmic chanting, that drifted on the night air. Most dismissed her words as grief-fed imagination, the mutterings of a lonely woman. But she persisted. "Something is wrong in that house," she insisted. "You'll see." The sheriff, John Peters, was a man bound by duty but cautious of scandal. He rode out to the farm under the guise of neighborly concern. Thomas met him at the gate, Bible in one hand, his stare unwavering. "We've nothing to hide," he said evenly. Peters asked to look inside the cellar. Thomas's refusal was polite, but absolute. "Too damp," he explained. "Rot set in the beams. Unsafe to enter." Peters, unprepared to challenge him without cause, nodded and left. Yet the unease followed him back into town. Meanwhile, the Hargreaves remained steadfast in their church attendance. Week after week, they sat in their pew, voices rising in hymns, heads bowed deeper than ever. Margaret's silence was unbroken, her eyes fixed on nothing. The children looked thinner still, their skin pale beneath the glow of the oil lamps. Mary clutched her Bible with white knuckles, as if afraid to let it go. To the congregation, it was a picture of endurance. To those who looked closer, it was something else, an image of strain, as though each hymn concealed a cry. The boys' disappearance transformed the town. Parents no longer allowed their children to wander freely. Men carried rifles on evening walks. Doors were barred at night, a rare practice in a place where neighbors once trusted neighbors. Fear had carved a wound into the community, and that wound had a shadow. The farmhouse at the edge of town, where lanterns burned too long and silence weighed too heavily. The longer William remained missing, the sharper the whispers became. Stories multiplied. Some claimed the Hargreaves children never played with others because they were forbidden to speak of the cellar. Others said Margaret had once been seen carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth to the root cellar at dusk, glancing over her shoulder as if hunted. None of these stories could be proven, but in the absence of answers, rumor thrived. The town preacher, Reverend Cole, urged restraint. From his pulpit, he reminded his flock that suspicion without proof was sin. "The Lord will reveal the truth in his time," he declared. And yet, even his sermons rang hollow when Thomas's voice thundered louder than any other in response. Some began to wonder whether Cole was protecting the family or simply too afraid to confront them. It was a group of boys, not men of authority, who brought the next spark of fear. Emboldened by whispers, they crept to the farmhouse one night, hiding in the cornrows until the lanterns dimmed. One of them, peering through a crack in the cellar door, claimed he saw Thomas below, standing in a circle of candles, his hands raised as though in prayer. The boy swore there were shapes on the ground, covered in cloth, and that a voice not belonging to Thomas echoed in the chamber. The boys fled in terror, breathless and pale, their story dismissed by parents as childish fantasy. But children, in their innocence, often see what adults refuse to face. By September, William Carter was presumed dead. His name was spoken in hushed tones, his absence a weight carried by every family. The blacksmith, broken with grief, no longer came to church. His wife sat alone, her face carved with sorrow. And still, the Hargreaves came, as immaculate as ever, their pew filled, their voices unwavering. To many, that devotion was proof of innocence. To others, it was proof of something far more chilling, that the mask of piety can cover sins too dark to imagine. And so the stage was set, a missing boy, a fearful town, and a family whose perfect attendance hid a secret sealed beneath the earth. The truth had not yet surfaced, but the ground was beginning to crack. By autumn of 1883, the unease in town had hardened into something heavier. Fear no longer whispered at kitchen tables. It sat openly in the pews of St. Matthew's, in the glances exchanged when the Hargreaves walked the aisle. Their presence, once admired, now carried a weight. And yet, every Sunday, there they were, lined like statues in the front row. Thomas with his booming voice, Margaret with her silence, the children pale and stiff. Devotion on display, even as suspicion swelled. The neighbors watched. They saw the lanterns flicker in the windows long past midnight. They noticed the children rarely set foot beyond the yard. They whispered about how thin Mary had grown, about John's hollow cheeks, about little Samuel's cough that seemed never to fade. But in a town where appearances were sacred, few dared speak aloud what they suspected. To accuse the most faithful family was to risk being branded blasphemous, or mad. Then came the stories of ritual. At first, only children told them. A farm boy swore he had crept near the Hargreaves' place one night and seen candlelight moving underground. Another said he heard a woman's cry carried faintly on the wind, though Margaret's lips were always sealed in public. Parents hushed them quickly. Stories, they said. Fancies. But as more tales emerged, they grew harder to dismiss. A group of teenagers, emboldened by fear and curiosity, lingered near the farmhouse one evening. They crouched in the shadows, breath caught in their throats, as faint chanting rose from below. One boy claimed he saw Thomas through a cellar window, arms outstretched, his face lit in firelight. He swore there were shapes, long, unmoving shapes, lying on the ground around him. The boys fled, their terror etched in their eyes. Their parents, unwilling to believe, dismissed it. But the seed was planted. Inside the church, tension sharpened. Reverend Cole continued to defend the family. He preached against gossip, warning that rumor was a sin as dangerous as violence. But his words no longer carried the same force. Some whispered that Thomas held too much sway over him, that his sermons bent to the will of the man whose baritone voice echoed loudest in the congregation. Cole denied it, but even he seemed unsettled when Thomas's eyes locked on his from the front pew. Margaret remained a shadow, drifting silently behind her husband. A few women in town swore they saw bruises on her wrists, faint but unmistakable. When asked, she lowered her gaze and offered no reply. Others said she once wept quietly in the churchyard when she thought no one was near. But when approached, she composed herself, muttered something about the Lord's trials, and slipped away. Her silence, once admired as piety, now felt like fear. The children became the town's greatest source of unease. Mary, only 12, seemed prematurely hardened, her gaze heavy with secrets. John barely spoke, avoiding the eyes of his peers. Samuel, the youngest, appeared frail, his cough worsening, his small frame shrinking. Once, during a hymn, his voice cracked into sobs before Thomas's hand gripped his shoulder, forcing him upright. The congregation looked on in silence, each too afraid to intervene. Still, despite the murmurs, no one dared act. It was Sarah Whitfield, the widow who had spoken before, who kept pressing. She confronted Sheriff Peters again, insisting the cellar hid what the town feared most. Peters listened but hesitated. To accuse Thomas without proof was to risk dividing the community, perhaps even destroying the church itself. "Until I see it with my own eyes," he told her, "I have no case." His words were cautious, but Sarah's resolve did not falter. "Then open your eyes," she said. By October, the tension boiled into dread. Another incident shook the town. A traveling merchant vanished after passing through the county. His wagon was found broken near the woods, but his body was never recovered. Whispers tied the disappearance to the same shadow that had swallowed William Carter. And inevitably, those whispers circled back to the Hargreaves farm. More than once, neighbors reported strange odors drifting from the property. Sharp, acrid, and unlike any farm smoke. One man swore he saw Thomas digging near the barn at dawn, burying something quickly before covering it with fresh soil. When asked, Thomas said it was just waste from the harvest. The man nodded, but unease gnawed at him. Later, he confided to his wife that the ground looked too freshly turned, too deliberate. The final spark came from a child, not an adult. One evening, Mary Hargreaves was seen near the fence line, her arms clutching a worn Bible. A neighbor's daughter approached her, curious. Mary looked at her with wide, desperate eyes and whispered only 4 words, "Don't go in cellar." Before the girl could respond, Thomas's voice thundered across the yard, calling Mary back. She obeyed instantly, vanishing into the house. The neighbor's daughter swore the warning was real, not childish fancy. When she told her parents, they silenced her, but the story spread quickly among the children. Soon, the entire town knew what Mary had said. By now, fear outweighed denial. The whispers became demands. The sheriff could no longer ignore the mounting stories, the unease of his people, the strange absences that haunted the county. With pressure mounting, he sought a warrant. It would be the first real step toward piercing the Hargreaves mask. And still, as the congregation gathered each Sunday, the family appeared in their pew, unflinching, their devotion louder than any accusation. To some, it was proof of innocence. To others, it was the most damning sign of all, that only a mask that carefully constructed could hide something monstrous beneath. The town stood at a threshold. The cellar door was still shut, but the people were no longer willing to look away. They were ready, at last, to force it open. The warrant came on a cold morning in November 1883. Sheriff Peters rode out with 2 deputies, the paper folded tightly in his coat pocket, its weight heavier than iron. The town watched as he passed, faces pressed to windows, hands clutching curtains. Few spoke, but everyone knew where he was going. For weeks, whispers had spread like wildfire. Now, at last, the law would open the cellar that had haunted their nights. The Hargreaves farm looked ordinary in the gray light. Smoke curled from the chimney, hens scratched in the yard, and the children stood near the porch as if waiting. Thomas emerged from the doorway before the sheriff dismounted, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Sheriff," he said evenly. His voice carried no fear, no hesitation, only a calm that chilled Peters more than defiance would have. "What brings you here?" Peters unfolded the paper, his hand steady though his chest tightened. "By order of the county court, I am authorized to search this property, particularly the cellar." For a moment, silence stretched. Margaret stood behind her husband, her eyes downcast. The children clutched one another, their faces pale as snow. Thomas's jaw flexed. "This is blasphemy," he said, his voice rising. "Our home is God's house. You would desecrate it with suspicion." But the law was on Peters's side. He motioned to the deputies. One approached the cellar door, its iron latch gleaming faintly. Thomas moved to block him, but Peters stepped forward. "Stand aside," he ordered. For the first time, Thomas hesitated. His eyes burned with something between fury and desperation. At last, he stepped back, his lips moving in a whisper no one could hear. The latch broke with a groan. The heavy door creaked open, releasing a breath of air thick with dampness and something fouler, an odor that twisted stomachs and silenced words. Lanterns were lit, their light spilling down the narrow steps. Peters descended first, every tread of his boots echoing in the hollow beneath. What met his eyes was worse than any rumor had dared imagine. The cellar was vast, its walls braced with beams, the floor packed earth. Candles burned in crude holders along the walls, their wax hardened into stalactites. In the center lay a circle marked into the dirt, symbols scratched deep, dark stains clinging to the grooves. Around it, cloth shapes stretched across the floor. Peters's breath caught as he knelt and pulled one open. Beneath the shroud lay the body of a boy, William Carter, his face pale, eyes closed, hands folded as if posed. His shirt bore dark stains, long dried. The deputies staggered back, covering their mouths. One dropped his lantern, its flames sputtering in the dirt. Peters forced himself forward, checking the other shapes. More bones, brittle and old, some wrapped in cloth, others scattered. At least 3 children, perhaps more, their remains hidden but not destroyed. It was a vault of death masquerading as a place of prayer. Against the far wall, shelves held jars filled with strange contents, dried herbs, bits of bone, and objects too grotesque to name. A Bible lay open on a small table, its margins scrawled with notes in Thomas's hand. Verses of judgment circled and underlined, passages about sacrifice, about obedience, about purging sin. It was scripture twisted into justification. When Peters rose, his face was ashen. "Get him out," he said flatly. The deputies turned, their hands shaking as they reached for Thomas. But Thomas did not resist. He lifted his arms calmly, almost triumphantly, as though this moment was foreordained. "You will not understand," he told them. "This was God's will. The blood was demanded." His voice carried up the stairs, into the cold air where the townspeople now gathered, drawn by dread curiosity. Margaret collapsed when the words reached her, her knees buckling. The children screamed, clutching her skirts, their terror raw. Neighbors gasped, crossing themselves, whispering prayers. Peters emerged from the cellar, his face grim. "There are bodies," he announced. The crowd recoiled, as if struck. The illusion of righteousness that had shielded the Hargreaves for years was shattered in a single sentence. Word spread faster than fire. By nightfall, the town was swollen with anger, grief, and disbelief. Parents wept for William Carter. Others remembered missing children from years past, tragedies they had once blamed on strangers or accidents. Now, they realized, the truth had been under their feet all along. The Hargreaves' piety had been nothing but a mask, a performance to cloak horrors beyond imagining. The sheriff's men kept guard over the farm that night, but no one slept. Lanterns burned in every window of the town, shadows moving as families clutched one another, their trust in their community broken. For the first time, the church bell stood silent. Its chime, once the heartbeat of the settlement, felt tainted by the family who had sat in its front pew with such devotion. Thomas was taken to the jail, his expression calm even as chains bound his wrists. He spoke to no one except to quote scripture, passages about sacrifice, obedience, and the cleansing of sin. Margaret sat in a separate room, weeping uncontrollably, her silence finally broken but her words incoherent. The children were taken in by neighbors, trembling, their bodies fragile from years of hidden strain. The cellar remained open that night, guarded but unsealed. Its stench lingered, drifting across the fields. Those who had seen inside would never forget it. Those who had not whispered about what else might still lie hidden in the earth. And for the first time in living memory, the people of Kentucky began to question not only the family that had deceived them, but the church that had sheltered them. Faith had been a shield. Now it was a wound. The trial of Thomas Hargreaves began in the winter of 1883, in a courthouse so crowded that men stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles and women clutched their shawls against the chill. It was not merely a trial of one man, but of an entire illusion. The family that never missed church, the man who led prayers louder than any, the children who sat like saints in the pews, all of it now stood under the merciless glare of truth. The evidence was undeniable. The body of William Carter lay in the cellar, his death recent and unmistakable. Alongside him, bones of at least 3 other children were identified, remains dating back years. The cellar's markings, the jars, the scrawled scripture, all painted a picture of ritual cloaked in twisted faith. Witnesses came forward, the farmhand who had heard chanting, the boys who had spied candlelight, the widow Sarah Whitfield whose warnings had been ignored. Each testimony struck another blow to the mask of piety Thomas had worn so carefully. Thomas himself did not deny it. Instead, he claimed it was divine mandate. In court, his voice carried the same authority it had in church. The Lord demanded obedience, he declared. The blood was an offering. I was chosen to carry his will. His words chilled the room. Some wept. Others shouted. The judge silenced them with a gavel, but the fear was already rooted. What horrified the town most was not only the crimes, but the conviction with which Thomas spoke, as though certain that heaven itself approved. Margaret was called to testify. At first, she could not speak. Her hands trembled, her voice cracked, her eyes fixed on the floor. At last, in a voice so faint it was nearly lost, she admitted what many had long suspected. She had known. She had not participated, but she had seen the lanterns, heard the cries, and kept silent out of fear. He said it was God's command, she whispered. He said if I spoke, the Lord would strike down our children. The court sat in stunned silence. Margaret's words were not just testimony against her husband, they were testimony against a society that had mistaken fear for virtue, silence for faith. The verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts. Thomas Hargreaves was sentenced to hang. The execution took place in early spring, on a wooden scaffold built in the town square. Hundreds gathered, their faces grim, their breaths held tight. Thomas stood tall, unrepentant, quoting scripture until the rope was fixed around his neck. The blood speaks, he said, his eyes turned skyward. Moments later, the trap was pulled, and his voice was silenced forever. But the end of Thomas did not end the wound he left behind. The community was fractured. Many questioned how they had failed to see what lay before them. Parents asked why they had ignored the children's pallor, Margaret's silence, the whispers of neighbors. The preacher, Reverend Cole, faced his own reckoning. Some accused him of protecting Thomas by preaching against gossip, of turning a blind eye to the unease in his flock. Attendance at St. Matthew's fell sharply. For the first time, families missed Sunday service not out of sickness or storm, but out of doubt. The church itself became a symbol of broken trust. Where once the front pew had been a place of pride, now it was a scar. People glanced at it uneasily, remembering the family who had occupied it with perfect devotion, their hands folded, their Bibles clutched, their secrets buried beneath their feet. Hymns no longer rang with certainty. Sermons no longer held the same power. Faith had been tested, and for many, it had failed. The Hargreaves children bore the deepest scars. Mary, John, and Samuel were placed with distant relatives, but their eyes carried shadows that no new home could erase. Mary, especially, seemed older than her years, her voice calm but heavy with truths she would never fully share. Samuel's cough lingered, his body weakened by years of hidden deprivation. Their names were whispered for decades after, often followed by silence, as though speaking too loudly might summon back the cellar's ghosts. As for Margaret, she faded into obscurity. Some pitied her as a victim, others condemned her as complicit. She moved away quietly, her whereabouts uncertain. To some, she remained the image of a woman broken by fear. To others, she was a reminder of how silence can be as damning as sin. In the years that followed, the town of St. Matthew's struggled to move forward. The church bell rang again, but its chime was different. Hollow, cautious, as if even metal remembered. The story of the Hargreaves spread beyond Kentucky, retold in newspapers and whispered in sermons as a warning. It was not simply the story of one man's madness, but of how easily a community can be blinded by the appearance of faith. History often remembers great battles, great leaders, and grand events. But sometimes, it is the small towns, the quiet pews, the cellars beneath ordinary farms that carry the darkest truths. The Hargreaves family never missed a Sunday service. And yet, beneath their home, in the soil of Kentucky, they built an altar not to God, but to a madness that wore his name. The front pew of St. Matthew's eventually filled again, but no family ever sat there with the same unbroken regularity. It remained a place of unease, a reminder carved into wood and memory. For generations, parents told their children the story not as gossip, but as warning, that evil does not always wear rags. Sometimes, it wears its finest clothes, bows its head, and sings the loudest hymn. And so the legacy of the Hargreaves endures, not in the pages of hymnals or in the echoes of prayer, but in the silence that followed their fall. A silence heavier than any sermon, deeper than any hymn. The silence of a community that realized too late that devotion can be a mask, and beneath it, darkness can thrive unseen.